The sun hung low over Chicago's south side, casting long shadows on cracked sidewalks. Evelyn and Josephine had walked these streets for over 7 decades, their memories etched into every brick and faded mural. They weren't just old women, they were history. But history didn't mean much to the boys leaning against the bodega across the street. 5 of them. Young. Restless. Looking for trouble. Evelyn adjusted her wide-brimmed blue hat, standing tall despite the weight of the humid air. Josephine, always the feisty one, clicked her tongue in frustration. "Look at this mess," she muttered, motioning to the empty lot that once held Mr. Johnson's bakery. "We used to jump rope right there." Evelyn sighed, her eyes soft with memories. "Best peach cobbler in the city." A voice cut through the air. "Ladies, ladies." They turned. The gang was crossing the street. The tallest of the bunch, wiry with a tattoo creeping up his neck, grinned, flashing a gold tooth. "Ain't safe for grannies out here." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "We don't want trouble." One of them, wearing a red hoodie, snorted. "Too late, this ain't your block no more." Josephine laughed, sharp and humorless. "Boy, we were here before your mama was born." The air shifted, the chuckles died. The leader took a step forward, his voice dropping. "That so?" Evelyn's stomach dropped. He cracked his knuckles. "Ain't no passing through without paying the toll." Josephine raised a brow. "Toll?" He smirked. "Yeah, hand over them purses." Josephine's lips curled into a smile. "Oh, you picked the wrong ones today." Evelyn reached into her purse. "Not for money." Tattoo Neck's smirk widened as he saw Evelyn reach into her purse. "Oh, what now? You calling the cops?" His boys laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. Red Hoodie shifted, gripping something in his pocket. Another one cracked his knuckles. The street had emptied, people watching from behind curtains, too scared to step in. Josephine didn't flinch. She squared her shoulders. "Boy, if we were scared of little punks like you, we wouldn't have made it past the 60s. Tattoo Neck's grin twitched. He stepped closer. "Lady, I don't think you understand. This ain't a request." He reached out. Josephine slapped his hand away like he was a misbehaving child. "And I don't think you understand. We ain't paying no toll." That was a mistake. The humor drained from his face. His fingers flexed. Wrong answer. With a sharp yank, he grabbed Josephine's purse. The strap held for half a second before snapping. She stumbled but didn't fall, didn't cry out, just glared at him like he was an annoying mosquito. Evelyn's heart pounded. Let go of her. Josephine took a step forward. "You got 3 seconds to drop that bag before I—" A loud crack split the air. One of the boys had smashed a glass bottle against the curb. The jagged edges glinted in his grip. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her phone. Tattoo Neck chuckled. Now, let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Evelyn's thumb pressed dial. Tattoo Neck saw it, snatched the phone from her hand. "Nah, we ain't doing that." His boys laughed. Evelyn tilted her head, voice calm. "Oh, you done messed up now." Tattoo Neck glanced at the phone screen, his smirk returning. "Who you calling, Grandma? Cops don't care about this side of town." But Evelyn wasn't looking at him. She just folded her arms, a slow, knowing smile creeping across her face. "You better hope he don't answer." That flicker of doubt crossed Tattoo Neck's eyes, just a flicker. "And who exactly is?" The phone rang back. A single word flashed on the screen. "Deacon." Laughter stopped. Red Hoodie took a small step back. Another boy whispered under his breath, "Nah, no way." Tattoo Neck's confidence wavered, but he played it off, forcing a chuckle. "Who the hell is Deacon?" Evelyn smiled, smooth and slow. "Go ahead, answer it." Tattoo Neck hesitated, gripping the phone tighter. Josephine adjusted her hat. "Oh, what's wrong? Thought you ran these streets." He scoffed but didn't move. Then, the distant roar of an engine, deep, low, powerful. A black Chevy Impala rolled up the block, its tires gliding over the pavement like a warning. The sun glinted off its polished hood. The street froze. Curtains twitched. Shop doors eased shut. Conversations died mid-sentence. The Impala came to a slow stop. The driver's door opened. A massive figure stepped out, his movements unhurried, deliberate. 6'6", built like a war machine, dressed in all black. A face carved from stone, cold and unreadable. Tattoo Neck's breath hitched. Josephine snatched her purse back with ease. "Oh, you ain't laughing now?" The figure took a step forward. Someone whispered his name. Deacon Ward. The street seemed to shrink around Deacon Ward as he stepped forward, and his broad shoulders cutting through the silence. His presence alone was enough to change the air, thicker, heavier, charged with something unspoken. Tattoo Neck clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure, but his fingers twitched. His boys, they weren't as good at hiding their fear. Red Hoodie took another step back, his sneakers scraping against the pavement. A kid barely old enough to shave muttered under his breath, "Ain't no way." Deacon didn't rush, didn't speak. He just looked. His eyes flicked to Evelyn, then to Josephine. "These them?" Evelyn nodded. "Just once." Tattoo Neck swallowed hard. "I ain't know they was your people." Josephine smirked. "You didn't ask." Deacon rolled his shoulders, the motion slow, deliberate. "That's a problem." Tattoo Neck held up his hands, taking a step back. "Look, man, it was just—" "Shut up." Tattoo Neck shut up. Deacon let the silence stretch, his eyes boring into the gang. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "You got two choices." The gang stiffened. "One," he lifted a single finger, "apologize, walk away." A pause. "Two," his fingers curled into a fist, "I make you." The words weren't loud. He didn't need them to be. Tattoo Neck's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "We good, man. Ain't that deep." Deacon took a step closer. "Don't look like she laughing." Tattoo Neck hesitated. Then the gang scattered, like roaches when the lights come on. The gang was gone, vanished into the alleys and side streets, leaving only the distant sound of sneakers slapping against pavement. Josephine dusted off her purse like nothing had happened. "Well, that was fun." Evelyn patted Deacon's arm, her voice smooth. "Still got it, baby." Deacon chuckled, shaking his head. "Y'all gotta stop walking around like you own the city." Josephine grinned. "But we do." They started down the street, Deacon walking between them, his broad frame cutting through the night like a battleship. The block was quiet now, but not peaceful. People were watching. From behind curtains, through shop windows, over the rims of their coffee cups at the corner diner. A couple of teenagers leaned against a lamppost, eyes darting to the Impala still parked at the curb, its engine cooling with sharp metallic pings. They weren't used to seeing a man like Deacon step out of a car like that and not leave a body behind. Josephine glanced at Evelyn. "We shouldn't have to call Deacon to handle that." Evelyn let out a slow breath. The world changed. She looked around at the empty lots and liquor stores, the boarded-up businesses where soul food spots and jazz clubs used to stand. But some things don't. Deacon stopped at their front steps, scanning the street. "Y'all need me to stick around?" Josephine scoffed. "Boy, please, you done enough for today." Evelyn squeezed his hand. "We got it from here." Deacon hesitated. He knew them. Knew that whatever they were planning, this wasn't over. They weren't just walking home. They were planning their next move. The next morning, Josephine and Evelyn were up early. Not because they were scared. No, fear wasn't in their blood. They had seen worse, fought harder battles, and still stood tall. But today wasn't about fighting. It was about showing up. Just after sunrise, they walked back to the same corner where the gang had tried them the night before. But this time, they weren't alone. A crowd followed them, neighbors, old friends, church folks, business owners, teachers who used to break up playground fights, even a few teenagers, hands stuffed deep in hoodie pockets watching with quiet curiosity. Some held signs, most didn't. Because the message wasn't written on cardboard, it was in their presence. A place only dies when the people in it stop showing up, and they weren't about to let that happen. Tattoo Neck and his crew were already there, leaning against the same bodega wall, watching. But something was different now. No laughter, no cocky smirks. Tattoo Neck's arms were crossed tight, his shoulders tense. His boys shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. They had expected the twins to back down, to disappear. Instead, they came back stronger. Josephine locked eyes with Tattoo Neck. "Ain't so funny now, huh?" For the first time, his gaze held something else. Not anger, not defiance, respect. He exhaled, glancing at his crew, then at the faces behind the twins. He could push back, start trouble, or he could listen. And as the sun climbed higher, painting the city in deep gold and warm orange, something shifted. Not everything, not overnight, but just enough. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Tattoo Neck stood there, his eyes flicking over the crowd that had gathered. It wasn't just the twins anymore. It was a neighborhood united, and for the first time in years, there was hope in the eyes of the people around him. He looked at his boys. Red Hoodie was shifting on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. The kid who had muttered earlier now kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. Even the older ones were quiet. Tattoo Neck felt the pressure, the weight of every eye on him. They weren't laughing anymore. Josephine stood tall beside Evelyn, her posture unwavering. The neighborhood knew them, respected them, and they knew what kind of fight these women had been in. They weren't afraid. "Y'all ain't scared?" Tattoo Neck asked, his voice low. He was looking at the twins, but the question was aimed at the crowd. Josephine tilted her head, an amused smile playing on her lips. "We've been fighting our whole lives. What's one more battle?" There it was again, the respect. It was in the way Tattoo Neck's eyes softened, the way his body relaxed ever so slightly. He had expected something different from the old women. Fear, submission, but instead, they stood their ground. He exhaled sharply, his mind working through the options. He could call his crew to escalate this, escalate everything, but there was something in the air, something he couldn't ignore, a quiet power, and for the first time he didn't push back, didn't crack a joke, didn't tell them to leave. Instead, he held the crowd's gaze and nodded slowly, acknowledging the shift. This wasn't his block anymore. The street was quieter now. No more shouting, no more threats. The only sounds were the soft hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the trees above. Tattoo Neck slowly unfolded his arms, and his gaze softened as he looked at Josephine and Evelyn. He cleared his throat, stepping toward the crowd with a certain hesitation. "Ain't nobody leaving," he said, his voice not as sure as before. The others around him shifted, sensing the change. Evelyn caught his eye and smiled just a little, the corners of her mouth curling with the wisdom only age could give. "It's not about leaving, baby. It's about standing your ground, and right now, this is our ground." Tattoo Neck's brow furrowed slightly. He glanced at his crew, some of whom were still uneasy, and then at the people standing behind the twins. Older men in their church suits, young mothers pushing strollers, even a few teenagers who were starting to look like they were beginning to understand something they hadn't before. He shook his head, almost in disbelief. "Guess I didn't realize it was like that," he muttered, almost to himself. Josephine smirked. "Most people don't, until they see it for themselves." Tattoo Neck stood still for a moment, processing. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small crumpled wad of cash, and tossed it toward the twins. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter now, his bravado completely gone. "For the trouble yesterday. That wasn't right." The crowd didn't move, but there was an energy in the air now, a sense that the rules had changed. Josephine didn't pick up the cash. Instead, she just nodded, her expression firm. "We don't need that, but you might want to think about how you walk through these streets next time." Tattoo Neck nodded, turning to walk away without another word. And for the first time in a long time, the block felt just a little bit more alive. As Tattoo Neck and his crew disappeared down the street, there was an eerie silence in the air. It wasn't the usual peace after a confrontation, where everyone just goes back to pretending it never happened. No, this silence had weight to it. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath everyone's feet. Josephine and Evelyn exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations they'd perfected over the years. It wasn't relief they felt. It was a quiet recognition that things had changed. Deacon was standing nearby, still watching the scene unfold. The Impala parked at the curb, its engine cold now, seemed like a distant memory. The twins hadn't needed him to take control today. They had done it themselves. Deacon nodded toward the crowd, a slow, appreciative gesture. "They got your back now." Evelyn smiled faintly, the weight of the moment settling in. They always did. They just needed to remember that. Josephine gave a satisfied hum. "That's what you get when you show up. They know who owns this block now." And that wasn't a boast, it was a fact. The crowd that had gathered around them wasn't just a collection of random people anymore. They were a community, one that was beginning to realize they had been living in fear for far too long. The truth was, they had been waiting for someone to remind them how to fight for what was theirs. The next few hours were spent in a quiet, shared sense of purpose. People returned to their homes, but there was something different in the way they moved, the way they spoke to each other. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were starting to reclaim their power. Josephine and Evelyn didn't need to say another word. They had done what needed to be done. The block had been tested, and it had passed. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the first signs of a new energy started to spread through the block. People gathered outside their homes in groups, chatting softly, but their eyes were alert now. Every corner had a feeling of solidarity, a quiet understanding that things had changed, and they were going to be part of it. A couple of the teens from earlier had returned, this time without their hoods up. They weren't slouched against the streetlight anymore. They were standing tall, their shoulders squared. They hadn't spoken to anyone yet, but their presence was enough. Word had spread. The twins weren't just a part of the neighborhood. They were the heart of it. Josephine and Evelyn sat on their porch steps, taking in the shift in the air. The neighborhood was alive again, not with the noise of violence or anger, but with the hum of people finding their voice. Josephine, ever the sharp one, let out a low whistle. "You hear that, Ev? It's the sound of us finally being seen." Evelyn smiled, her hands folded on her lap. "It's about time." Deacon was still around, leaning against the Impala, watching from a distance. He didn't need to be the muscle today. The community had already shown what it was capable of. But what mattered wasn't just the change on the block. It was what it meant. They hadn't backed down. They hadn't folded in the face of fear. And because of that, the entire street had started to remember what it was like to stand together. "Tomorrow," Josephine said softly, "we do more. We keep showing up." Evelyn nodded. "One step at a time, baby. One step at a time." And for the first time in a long time, the streets of their block felt like home. The next morning, the block looked different. It wasn't in the buildings or the storefronts. It was in the faces of the people. The air was still, quiet, but there was a sense of purpose in the way people moved. Josephine and Evelyn had started something the day before, and now it was time for the neighborhood to take the next step. They couldn't wait for someone else to come in and fix things. They had to do it themselves. Evelyn had already started calling the local church leaders, asking them to meet later in the day. The word spread fast, and by noon there was a small gathering of community members in front of the corner store, all of them listening as Evelyn laid out a plan. "We've been quiet for too long," Evelyn began, her voice firm and steady. "This is our home, and we're not letting anyone take that from us anymore." Josephine was standing beside her, arms crossed, her expression one of quiet confidence. "We're not asking for permission. We're showing up." There was a low murmur from the crowd. The church leaders nodded, the older men and women who had lived through decades of hardship, knowing that what they were hearing wasn't just a call to action. It was a call to reclaim. One of the teenagers, a girl no older than 16, raised her hand. "What about the gangs? What if they come back?" Josephine looked at the girl with a small smile. "When you stand tall, no one can knock you down." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice ringing out. "It's time to remind everyone that this street is not for sale. We're taking it back." The crowd erupted in quiet applause. They weren't just standing around anymore. They were rallying. They were becoming something they hadn't been in years. A force. And as they dispersed to spread the word, Josephine and Evelyn exchanged a look. They didn't need words to know what the other was thinking. The fight was far from over. But now they had each other. As the afternoon sun bathed the block in a warm golden light, people began to gather once more. This time, it wasn't just the usual crowd of old friends and neighbors. There were new faces, too. People who hadn't spoken in years. People who had been too afraid to stand up, now stepping forward. Evelyn and Josephine stood at the center, their presence commanding attention without needing to say a word. Deacon had returned, but he wasn't leading the charge today. He stood back, watching, a sense of pride in his eyes as he observed the growing unity on the block. The first act of their plan was simple but profound: a cleanup. The streets had been littered with trash for months, a visual sign of how neglected the neighborhood had become. But this time, as the community worked together, it wasn't just about cleaning up the litter, it was about reclaiming their pride. Josephine picked up a piece of garbage, tossing it into the bag with a satisfied grunt. "Ain't nothing too big to fix if we start with the little things," she muttered, looking over at Evelyn. Evelyn smiled, nodding in agreement. "That's right, baby. One step at a time." As the people worked, they spoke. They shared stories. They told each other what they'd been through. They talked about the past, about how things used to be when the block was full of life and laughter, and how they had to get back to that. The teenagers who had once hung on the corners now grabbed brooms and trash bags. The adults were chatting with each other, making plans for a meeting the following week to discuss how they would keep pushing forward. It was a small step, but it was a step that meant more than just cleaning up the streets. It was about showing the world that they weren't backing down anymore. They weren't going to let the street slip further into decay, not without a fight. By the time the sun began to set, the block was already looking different. The trash was gone, the storefronts were starting to look a little less abandoned, and most importantly, the people were together. Josephine glanced around at the progress. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. Evelyn nodded, a knowing glint in her eye. "We've got a long road ahead of us, but it's ours to walk." And with that, they stepped off the curb, moving forward, side by side, into the future they were determined to create. The next few days passed in a haze of change. The block had come alive in a way it hadn't in years. People were starting to feel the spark of unity once again. But the real test was coming. Josephine and Evelyn knew this couldn't just be about cleaning up the streets or rallying the people. They had to take the fight to the heart of what had caused the decay in the first place. The gangs. The threat that had been hanging over the block for so long wasn't just going to disappear because they cleaned up the sidewalk. It was deeper than that. As the day wore on, word came through. Tattoo Neck and his crew were back. The twins exchanged a glance, but there was no fear in their eyes. They had seen worse in their lives, fought harder battles. This wasn't the same as before. They weren't alone now. Evelyn pulled out her phone, dialing a number. She spoke quietly, her tone as steady as ever. "Deacon, they're back. We need you." Josephine walked over to the window, peering outside. Sure enough, a few familiar figures were lingering at the corner, their heads down but their eyes scanning, waiting for the right moment. "It's not just the boys, Ev," Josephine said, her voice low. "The whole gang is circling." Evelyn sighed but didn't hesitate. "Then it's time to show them who runs this block." The two women stepped outside, their heels clicking against the pavement, as if marking the beat of their determined march. People began to gather again, the whispers of what was happening spreading like wildfire. Deacon arrived moments later, his presence as commanding as ever. He didn't have to say a word. The people knew. The message was clear. Tattoo Neck and his crew didn't back down, but their confidence was noticeably shaken. They had crossed a line. Evelyn didn't flinch as she met their gaze. "You don't own this block," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "Not anymore." The tension in the air thickened, but this time the community stood behind the twins. They were no longer just a couple of elderly women. They were the heart of the movement, the soul of the fight. Tattoo Neck hesitated, glancing at his crew. The block wasn't the same anymore. This wasn't just about power. It was about who had the people on their side. The gang slowly began to back off, their postures stiff, unsure of their next move. Evelyn smiled faintly. "That's what happens when you mess with the wrong people." The block was quiet for the rest of the day, the tension from earlier slowly dissipating. But Evelyn and Josephine knew better than to believe that meant peace had returned. They'd made a statement, sure, but statements alone didn't keep people safe. And with that quiet came a looming sense of uncertainty. It wasn't long before the next challenge surfaced, an unexpected one. Late that night, as Josephine and Evelyn sat on the porch, watching the stars, a black SUV rolled up the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Evelyn's hand tightened around her cane. "This isn't good." Josephine didn't need to ask why. She'd felt the shift in the air the moment the vehicle appeared. The street had been calm for the first time in months, and the last thing they needed was more outsiders thinking they could take control. The SUV stopped right in front of the diner, its engine still humming as the driver's door opened. A man in a sharp suit stepped out. He was tall, confident, with an air of authority that came from years of wielding power. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. She didn't recognize him. Josephine squinted, trying to make out his face. "Who is that?" Evelyn's mind raced. She had a bad feeling about this. "I don't know, but we'll find out." Before they could react, the man started walking toward them, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Good evening, ladies, he greeted, his voice smooth but with an edge to it. I trust you're doing well? Evelyn didn't smile. She didn't trust anyone who showed up unannounced in the middle of the night, especially not someone dressed like he owned the city. Who are you? She asked, her voice steady, a hint of challenge in it. The man chuckled, a cold, calculating sound. Let's just say I'm someone who has an interest in this block, and you, ladies, seem to be the ones causing a bit of a stir. Josephine's eyes narrowed. We're just trying to get things back to the way they were. This block belongs to us. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid you're mistaken. This block belongs to whoever controls it, and I'm here to make sure that's not you. Evelyn stood a little straighter. You think you can come in here and take it from us? The man raised an eyebrow, unfazed. I think you'll find I have resources that you can't even begin to comprehend. The air between them grew thick. Evelyn and Josephine had dealt with their fair share of threats over the years, but this man was different. He wasn't just some gang leader trying to intimidate them. He was someone who wielded influence. Josephine took a deep breath, her hand on the railing, and spoke with the same cold resolve she always carried. We've faced worse. You can try, but you won't take anything from us. Not today, not ever. The man's eyes glinted with something darker. We'll see about that. Without another word, he turned and walked back to the SUV, his footsteps echoing down the street. The vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the night. Josephine exhaled slowly, her expression hard. That's not the last we'll see of him. Evelyn's gaze lingered on the spot where the SUV had been. No, it's just the beginning. The next few days were filled with whispers. Word had spread fast about the man in the suit. People didn't know who he was, but they knew one thing for sure. He wasn't someone they could afford to ignore. Evelyn and Josephine knew that the fight wasn't just about reclaiming the block anymore. It was about standing up to a new kind of threat, one that didn't rely on fear or force, but on control and manipulation. The man in the suit wasn't the same as Tattoo Neck and his crew. He was smarter, more dangerous. That night, as they sat on the porch again, Evelyn turned to Josephine. We need to prepare. This isn't going to be over anytime soon. Josephine nodded, her eyes hard. I've been through worse, Ev. We've both been through worse. But this feels different. This man, he's not like the others. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to think of a way to fight back against this new force. The street had always been theirs, its history was theirs, but this new threat had power that could extend beyond their reach. The man had resources. He wasn't afraid to pull strings. He wasn't just fighting for a block. He was fighting for control of something bigger. We need allies, Evelyn said, her voice steady. Josephine raised an eyebrow. Allies? Yes, people who aren't afraid of him, people who know how to play the game on his level. Josephine leaned back in her chair, considering it. You think we can find someone who can stand up to him? Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then nodded. We don't have a choice. If we want to keep this block, we'll need to go beyond what we've done so far. We'll need a plan. Josephine stood up, adjusting her hat. Then we make a plan. We've always made a way, haven't we? Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the years of wisdom and experience that had kept her going all these years. We'll figure it out, Joe. We always do. The night grew quiet again, but this time there was an air of resolve between them. They weren't just fighting to get their block back. They were fighting for control, fighting for the future. As the two women sat in silence, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both tense. But it wasn't the man in the suit. It was Deacon. He had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to join the conversation. You're right, he said, stepping forward. It's time to step it up. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes sharp. You think we can take on someone like that? Deacon gave a half smile, a glint of defiance in his eyes. I think we can do anything we put our minds to, but we'll need more than just muscle. We need strategy, and I've got a few ideas. Evelyn nodded, knowing that this battle was about to get more complicated than they'd ever imagined. But she also knew one thing for sure. They weren't backing down. The next morning, the air was thick with determination. Evelyn and Josephine were used to fighting, but now it felt like a different kind of battle. They had to be smarter, sharper, and more strategic than ever before. Deacon sat down with them in the kitchen, a serious look on his face. He had seen the kind of power their new enemy wielded, and he wasn't underestimating him. We can't just rely on muscle. This man, whoever he is playing a different game. We need to get ahead of him. Fast. Evelyn leaned forward, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table. What's your plan, Deacon? Deacon didn't hesitate. We need to find out everything we can about him. Who he is, who he works with, where he's getting his money, his influence, everything. We get the intel and we turn it into leverage. Then we start making moves. Josephine raised an eyebrow. You think we can outsmart him? I don't think we have a choice, Deacon replied. We need to hit him where it hurts. Evelyn nodded, her mind working quickly. We've got connections. People who've been around here long enough to know things others don't. We'll talk to them. It's time to dig deep. The three of them spent the next few days working in the shadows, talking to old contacts, reaching out to people they hadn't seen in years. They followed leads, made phone calls, and put together pieces of a puzzle that had been carefully hidden. Slowly, they began to uncover a trail, an intricate web of business deals, shady partnerships, and backdoor meetings that connected the man in the suit to even bigger players. The more they learned, the more dangerous he seemed. But Evelyn wasn't afraid. She had lived through tougher times, and this wasn't the first time she had to fight against something bigger than herself. Josephine stood by her side, her resolve unwavering. We've been through hell and back, Ev, and we've always come out on top. This time's no different. The plan was coming together. Every detail was falling into place, and now they were ready to make their next move. But they needed one last piece of the puzzle. They needed someone who knew the man in the suit personally, someone who could tell them exactly how to break him down. Evelyn turned to Deacon. We need to find someone who's been on the inside, someone who's worked with him. Do you know anyone? Deacon hesitated, his eyes thoughtful. I might, but they're not easy to find. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. We don't have time to waste. Find them. Now. As Deacon left the house to track down their last lead, Evelyn and Josephine exchanged a look. They could feel it. The storm was coming, and they weren't backing down. The sun had barely risen when Deacon returned, his face set in a grim expression. Evelyn and Josephine were already sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for the news. We've got someone, Deacon said quietly, slipping into the room. He took a seat across from them, leaning in slightly as if the weight of the situation was heavy on his shoulders. Her name's Marissa. She worked with the man in the suit, helped set up a lot of his operations around here. Josephine's eyebrows shot up. You think she'll help us? Deacon nodded. She's not exactly loyal to him. She's seen enough to know what he's capable of, but she's cautious. You're not going to get anything from her without earning her trust. Evelyn glanced at Josephine. We've never had a problem with that, have we? Josephine chuckled softly. Not since we were kids. Evelyn turned back to Deacon. Where do we find her? Her place is a couple blocks over, behind the old laundromat. It's not easy to get to, but I know how to find her. I'll go with you. Evelyn stood up, her eyes steely. We don't have time to waste. Let's go. The trio left the house quietly, the streets still wet from the early morning drizzle. Deacon led them through the familiar cracked streets, past boarded-up buildings and faded storefronts. The city felt different today, darker, more dangerous, but Evelyn held her head high. They reached a narrow alleyway, the entrance hidden behind a rusted dumpster. Deacon knocked twice on the weathered door. A few moments passed before the sound of locks turning echoed through the alley. The door creaked open, revealing a woman with sharp eyes and a guarded expression. Deacon, she said, her voice low and cautious. What do you want? This isn't just about me, Marissa. We need your help. We're fighting the man in the suit, and we need everything you know about him. Marissa's eyes flickered to Evelyn and Josephine, her gaze lingering a little longer on Josephine, who met her stare without flinching. The silence stretched between them. Then finally, Marissa spoke again. You're making a big mistake, getting involved with him. He's not someone you want to mess with. We've been through worse, Josephine said, her voice sharp. We've seen things you can't even imagine. We're not afraid. Marissa studied them for a long moment, then sighed. All right, I'll tell you what I know. But be warned, once you're in, there's no turning back. Evelyn's lips curled into a faint smile. We've never turned back before. With a nod, Marissa led them inside, and for the first time, they felt like they were on the edge of discovering the truth they'd been hunting for. Inside the dimly lit room, the walls were lined with old papers, maps, and photographs, scattered haphazardly across the table. The place smelled like stale cigarettes and coffee. Marissa motioned for them to sit, her eyes scanning the room as though she was checking for something or someone. "I don't trust many people anymore," Marissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I trust Deacon, and I know what this man has done. He doesn't just control the streets, he controls everything. Money, power, people. He has connections everywhere." Josephine leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "What's his endgame? What's he really after?" Marissa hesitated before speaking. "It's not just about control, it's about erasing people. He's been buying up businesses, property, anything of value. You think those boarded-up stores are just a coincidence? He's setting the stage for something bigger." "Thank you all for coming," Evelyn began, her voice steady and commanding. "We're here because this neighborhood is more than just a place. It's our home, and it's being taken from us." Josephine stepped forward, her presence sharp and unwavering. "We've fought for this place before. We fought to make it ours, and we'll fight to keep it ours. But we need you, all of you." The room was quiet, the weight of their words settling in. Deacon was standing at the back of the room, watching the crowd closely. He could feel the tension in the air, the kind of energy that built up just before something big happened. A young man in the back stood up. "What's the plan?" Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "The man behind all of this, the one who thinks he can take everything we've built and erase us. His time is up. We've got the information, we've got the power, but we need you to help us make sure he doesn't win." Josephine added, "We're not asking for your permission. We're asking for your strength. This is our fight, but we can't win it alone." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. People stood up, clapping, some shouting their support. The energy was electric now. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about their pride, their unity. "Tomorrow," Evelyn continued, "we take it to the streets. We make sure he knows that we're not going anywhere." The crowd cheered. The tension, the uncertainty, everything seemed to melt away, replaced by something stronger. Hope. They had their army now, and this time they weren't going to be ignored. As the meeting broke up, the mood was different. People shook hands, exchanged numbers, and made plans. It felt like the first step in a long, hard fight. But the twins knew this was it. They weren't just going to take back their block, they were going to take back their future. The sun had barely begun to set, casting a golden hue over the city. It wasn't the peace that they were used to. The air felt thick, charged with anticipation. Evelyn and Josephine, standing shoulder to shoulder, watched as the crowd gathered outside, ready to take back what was theirs. The neighborhood was quiet, but it wasn't the usual calm. It was the calm before a storm. Deacon walked up to them, his presence as commanding as ever. He didn't say a word, he simply nodded, his eyes scanning the streets. The plan was simple: make their presence known, march through the heart of their community, and remind everyone that this was their home. They weren't leaving without a fight, and they didn't care who they had to face to make sure that everyone knew it. People lined the sidewalks as they walked down the street. Neighbors, friends, even people who hadn't spoken to them in years were standing together now. There was a shared sense of purpose in the air, something they hadn't felt in a long time. The neighborhood that had been broken and divided was starting to come back together. Tattoo Neck and his crew were standing on the corner, watching them. The same group who had once threatened them now looked unsure. There was no arrogance in their stance now, no swagger. It was as if the very sight of the crowd had drained their confidence. Josephine took the lead, her voice ringing out. "This is our block. We've lived here longer than most of you have even been alive. You're not pushing us out." Evelyn stepped beside her, her voice low but filled with authority. "You think you can control us? Think again. We're not afraid anymore." Tattoo Neck swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously to the crowd behind them. "I ain't gonna argue with y'all. I didn't know you had this many people with you." Evelyn's lips curved into a smile. "You didn't know, but you know now, and you'll remember it." The group didn't say another word. They turned and walked away, their heads down, leaving the street to the people who had stood their ground. As they reached the heart of the block, Josephine stopped, her eyes locking with Evelyn's. "We've done it, haven't we?" Evelyn nodded, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. "This place will never be the same, and neither will we." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in a unified chorus. It wasn't just the victory, it was the realization that the fight was never over, and that they would always stand together, no matter the odds. Deacon watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed over his chest. He knew that what they had done today wasn't just a victory, it was a message that the people who had lived through everything, who had weathered every storm, would never back down. They were still here, still fighting, and they weren't going anywhere. The block, the neighborhood, the fight, it was theirs, and no one could take that away. As the night fell, the street was alive with the sound of victory, the air finally feeling lighter, filled with a new sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for now, it was theirs. The sun had fully set, leaving only the streetlights to illuminate the path ahead. The block was still buzzing with the energy of what had just happened. People were talking, laughing, embracing. Evelyn and Josephine stood at the corner, looking at the street they had known for decades. The block that had once been a battlefield, now a symbol of unity, strength, and resilience. Deacon stood a few paces away, observing quietly. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes told it all. He was proud. Proud of his aunts, proud of the community they had rallied together, and proud of the message they had sent. "It feels different now," Josephine said, adjusting her hat and letting out a long breath. "Not like it used to, but maybe that's a good thing." Evelyn smiled, her eyes soft but determined. "It's better. The fight isn't over, but we've shown them that this block, this community, our people, aren't going anywhere." Josephine gave a small chuckle. "Guess we've still got a lot of fight left in us after all these years." Evelyn nodded, her gaze steady as she looked at the street, the stores that had been there since their youth, the people who had fought beside them. "We do. We always have." Deacon stepped forward, his presence as commanding as ever. "You know, you two might be the only people left in this neighborhood that can make them respected again." Josephine raised an eyebrow, a sly grin forming. "We ain't done yet, baby. This is just the beginning." Evelyn's eyes sparkled as she looked around, seeing the faces of those who had stood with them. The neighbors, the children, the old friends. "No, it's just the beginning of something bigger. This is our home, and we're going to protect it." They walked slowly, side by side, as the night deepened, the city around them starting to settle into a calm. But for the first time in a long time, the calm felt like peace. It was a peace that came from knowing that they had stood tall, that they had fought for what was right, and that they had changed the tide for their neighborhood. Josephine looked at Evelyn, her voice quiet but resolute. "We'll always fight, won't we?" Evelyn's smile was knowing. As long as we have breath in our bodies, we will. And as they walked into the night, they knew that they had made a difference. Not just for themselves, but for the community that had stood behind them. The legacy of the block was reborn. The fight, for now, was theirs. As the final moments of the story unfold, we ask you, what would you do if your home, your community, was under threat? Would you stand up and fight for what's yours, just like Evelyn and Josephine did? Remember, the fight for justice, unity, and respect is never over. It's a fight we all need to be part of. If you're inspired by their resilience, share this story with your friends and family, and let it be a reminder that no matter how much things change, the spirit of unity and the power of standing up for what's right will always remain. Like, share, and comment below with your thoughts. What's your legacy going to be? Stand with us. Stand with your community. Never back down.